And this is why hybrid war, Chris, is such a brilliant invention. The Russians have been using it for well over a decade. The Chinese have been using it since before Frank Hoffman came up with the term. And it's a genius move because Western democracies are very reluctant to confront it by saying, this may be a hybrid war, but it's still a war and we're going to act. We are much more comfortable saying to ourselves, oh, it's just a bit of provocation, everything's normal, it's fine, let's not worry. We don't want to alarm our people. We don't want to be unpopular by saying there's a big problem and we've got to do something about it. So we're just going to let it slide. No country has yet come up with an effective response that stops or deters hybrid war.
Over the past weekend, Denmark reported unidentified drones had appeared above its major military bases. It was the country's third drone alarm in a week, and one of 5 European nations in a month to experience incursions from either drones suspected of Russian origin or from the Russian Air Force itself. So, why is Russia violating Europe's skies, seemingly with impunity? Political and international editor Peter Hartcher says it's all part of a hybrid war, and one that Australia is no stranger to. And, Hartcher argues, the West has been blind to these attacks. So Peter, we've been hearing more and more about these unidentified drones flying into European countries. Can you briefly explain what exactly has been happening?
Absolutely. An increasing number of drones, as you say, unidentified, has been repeatedly flying into countries in Europe, most notably the close neighbours of Russia. And while they are unidentified, there's a strong suspicion that they are all from Russia, and the governments of the affected countries are saying so.
Earlier this month, Russia sent some 20 drones into Poland's airspace. Then it sent a drone into Romania. And for 12 minutes on September 19th, 3 Russian fighter jets lingered over the skies in Estonia before NATO mobilized F-35 jet fighters to repel them.
And the Poles have convened urgent meetings of the NATO alliance. The Estonians did the same. They've appealed to the UN Security Council because they're all concerned that this is a deliberate and systematic program of harassment and intimidation by Russia against its European neighbours.
You say these drone incursions are not a coincidence. Surprise, surprise. Part of a strategy you describe as the so-called mush response. Can you talk us through what that means exactly and what the bigger picture here is?
Yeah, absolutely. The mush response, that comes from a quote which supposedly was uttered by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the founder of the modern Soviet Union. And he had a quote where he was supposed to be talking about clearing mines, landmines, and he said, "Probe with a bayonet. If you encounter mush, keep going. If you encounter steel, withdraw." So what his successor, Vladimir Putin, is doing today is like probing with a bayonet, except he's probing with drones and aircraft, but also other kinds of sabotage attacks on these countries. To test, one of the purposes is to test them, to test their responses, to see what they do, how they deal with these incursions, whether they have the steel to stop him or whether he encounters the mush, which will just encourage him to keep going. I should add that on a much less publicised level, this has been going on in various elements, not just drones, but with sabotage attacks of various kinds, cybersecurity attacks and all sorts of things. This has been going on for years, but it's really ramped up in these last few weeks, the last month or so. And you ask, what's the bigger picture? Well, this is a pretty big picture right here. Since Donald Trump invited Vladimir Putin to Alaska last month, literally rolling out the red carpet in the US soil to an indicted war criminal, Putin has since then shown signs of being encouraged that the US will not act against him. So the timing coincides with the stepping up of these drone and Russian Air Force incursions into Europe. But also we have reports from Bloomberg News Service, quoting unnamed Kremlin insiders, saying that Putin concluded as a result of that Alaska summit with Trump that the US would not stand in his way. And so that apparently seems to have encouraged him to really step up this testing of the European members of NATO with drones, but also with other elements of his probing bayonet to test their strength, to confuse them, and with any luck, he hopes to divide them.
So is it fair to say then that the rolling out of the red carpet, so to speak, in Alaska was a mush response? It was encountering mush and not steel. And is Vladimir Putin encountering mush or steel from other countries?
Yes, I would say it absolutely is. The US under Trump has gone to mush on anything to do with Russia. When Trump rolled out his so-called Liberation Day tariffs on almost every country on Earth, even including penguin colonies in Australian territories in the Antarctic, there were a few countries notably exempted from his tariffs. Russia was one of them, believe it or not. And the excuse for that is, we don't have any meaningful trade with Russia. Well, that's not so. It's in the billions of dollars, and Putin boasted at Alaska that the trade with the US and Russia is growing. So that's just one indicator. But Donald Trump's refusal to lift a finger against Russia's incursions, invasion of Ukraine, is another. Now, some might say, but hang on, didn't we hear the news that Donald Trump just a few days ago was asked, should European countries shoot down Russian military assets that fly into their airspace? And he said, yes, they should. So isn't that a tough response? How could that be a mush response? The answer is in the second part of his answer, which didn't get much publicity at all. He said, yes, they should shoot them down. The reporter's next question was, will you use US military assets to do so? And he said, depends on circumstances.
You said that you thought that they should shoot down the Russian aircraft. Would you back them up? Would the United States help them out in some way?
Depends on the circumstance, but we're very strong toward NATO.
In other words, he's once again casting doubt on the US's willingness to enforce its own treaty commitments under NATO, that an Article 5, which says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all, including the US. So he's left the US out. And once again, we see that he's leaving some doubt and ambiguity and giving, again, Putin an entry point.
And of course, Peter, just on Wednesday morning, we've seen Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump haul in their top military brass, really, and deliver quite an extraordinary politically charged address about their expectations. How should we interpret that?
Well, apart from the political rhetoric employed, I think the larger meaning of that is that Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth are turning the attentions of their warrior leadership class internally into the US rather than externally to look at foreign foes. Hegseth talked about needing to bring punishing levels of pain on America's enemies, but the only enemies that Trump talked about when he addressed the troops, or the leadership of the troops, 800 generals and admirals, was the enemy within.
Well, America is under invasion from within. We're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. At least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out. These people don't have uniforms. But we are under invasion from within. We're stopping it very quickly.
He's talking about the radical left. He's talking about the Democratic Party. And he's deploying US troops city by city around the country. That's where his focus is. So my interpretation is Trump's political project of an authoritarian consolidation of power in the US is his priority. Foreign wars are just not.
Okay, so you've talked about the use of drones, but you also talked about other means, other forms of sabotage, if you will. What is it that happened in Lithuania recently, and what else is Russia up to?
The Lithuanians arrested, just in the last few days, 15 people, all of whom it alleges have links to Russian military intelligence. And they're all charged with putting bombs, explosive parcels, onto aircraft, cargo planes in Germany, in Britain, elsewhere in Europe. And the idea apparently is that they will explode or catch fire mid-air and crash civilian cargo planes. As it happens, all of these ones in particular did start fires, but they were in planes while they were still on the ground, where they were detected and extinguished and no real harm was done. But there's lots of other sabotage. Radar jamming, GPS jamming.
A plane carrying the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was targeted by GPS jamming while trying to land in Bulgaria. A spokesperson has said it's believed the interference was carried out by Russia. The plane landed safely after the pilots used paper maps.
The cutting of undersea communications fibre optic cables in the Baltic Sea, there's been quite a few of those, and the NATO and Baltic countries have had to step up their maritime patrols to prevent that continuing. There have been dozens of attacks, small scale, but all sabotage aimed at destabilising energy systems in Europe, health systems in Europe, cyber attacks on the banking systems. This is persistent, but now finally it looks like the Europeans are getting organised to do something more about it, but they are far yet from shooting down Russian assets, Russian certainly military jets, and they're far from declaring it the war, which it is. I mean, it's not a conventional shooting war, but it's a hybrid war. A hybrid war is simply a mixture, a combination of military and non-military strategy and assets, entirely flexible, completely wide open, and used to try to keep, as you mentioned, just below the threshold of conventional war to make it much harder for democracies to respond.
Well, let's talk about that a bit. You just mentioned quite a lot of examples of opportunities to hit steel, if you will. We talked a little bit about Trump's response to this. Talk about the West's response, Europe's response more broadly. Where are we at?
Yeah. Well, let me start with an illuminating quote from the Prime Minister of Poland. And by way of preface, Poland is perhaps the most hard-headed and best armed of the NATO countries, proportionate to its size. It spends more of its GDP on defence than the US does, over 4%. It's got an army now of armed forces of 200,000 people, which is the biggest in NATO after the US and Turkey. For a smallish country, it's a very serious country. Its Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, said recently, in March actually, he said, here's the situation. We have 500 million Europeans begging 300 million Americans to protect us against 120 million Russians. What is wrong with this picture? His point is, and he said this, he said, Europe can be a great power, but we have to stand up and we have to unite. So that's the view from Poland, that the European Union, the major powers of Europe, are trembling on the brink of acting seriously, but they aren't yet there. Donald Trump, as you know, cajoled and pressured the European members of NATO to step up their defence spending as a percentage of GDP, currently averaging 2%. He's pushed them where they've now all agreed to go to 3.5% of GDP on their defence. Australia's, by the way, is 2 at the moment and pledged to go up to 2.5%. And with another 1.5% of GDP equivalent to be spent on military-related infrastructure. So, there's direction, there's momentum, there's promised funding. There's a rearmament program in a number of European countries. The Germans have got a very major and serious one underway. Half a dozen countries have resumed their national service. So they're all getting there. And yet they're trembling on the brink of saying this is a hybrid war, it's coming from Russia, we're under threat. And the two logical responses there, Chris, would be first, to do much more to help Ukraine, recognising that Ukraine is the first barrier, the first hurdle that Putin has to cross to get into Eastern Europe and then Western. And second, to simply take a tougher approach on all these Russian incursions. They're still buying large quantities of Russian gas, for example, which is fueling Putin's war machine. They simply have to find an alternative. And oil. They have to shut their purchases down because they're putting billions of dollars directly into Putin's hands. Second thing is to get tougher on his military assets, fry the drones, shoot down the jets, and maybe even go further. It's all defensive action, but it's all got to be much firmer. There's no steel there yet.
Well, Tusk, the Polish PM who you mentioned, said that this is the closest, in his opinion, that we've been to open conflict since World War II. That's an extraordinary thing to say. What are his counterparts saying in Europe, talking about tougher action? Are any of them actually talking about that?
The pluckiest and most assertive states are the small Baltic states, because they're the ones right on the border. The 3 Baltic states, so Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, plus Poland, they're the boldest and the most assertive, but they're small. And they're going to be very reluctant to take more aggressive action against Russia unless they're confident of the backing of the bigger powers. The Germans, the French, the Brits are the major ones. And remember too that the French and the Brits both have nuclear weapons programs. So we're talking about highly sophisticated countries with long histories and great expertise, but the missing ingredient is willpower, political willpower. And this is why hybrid war, Chris, is such a brilliant invention. The term was only invented in 2007, by the way. An American strategist called Frank Hoffman came up with the term. But the Russians have been using it for well over a decade. The Chinese have been using it since before Frank Hoffman came up with the term. And it's a genius move because Western democracies are very reluctant to confront it by saying, this may be a hybrid war, but it's still a war and we're going to act. We are much more comfortable saying to ourselves, oh, it's just a bit of provocation, everything's normal, it's fine, let's not worry. We don't want to alarm our people. We don't want to be unpopular by saying there's a big problem and we've got to do something about it. So we're just going to let it slide. No country has yet come up with an effective response that stops or deters hybrid war.
Well, let's talk about hybrid war a little more and the context of China. You believe a similar complacency is happening here with China. How so?
Well, we were very complacent for a long time and content to ignore China's operations, covert mostly, because China was such a fantastic export partner and big investor into Australia. Now, we snapped out of that in 2017. The Sam Dastyari scandal, you'll remember the Labor senator who really exposed himself as being under the sway of a Chinese billionaire. The billionaire Huang Zhimou was an agent of influence for the Chinese Communist Party. And that was a real wake-up moment for Australia because it showed how easily a Chinese, in this case, apparently a businessman with a lot of money and making investments in Australia, could win over an Australian senator from one of the major parties of government in the country. And everything he was doing, by the way, everything that Sam Dastyari did in taking money and favours from this guy was legal. Turnbull was in power. That forced him and the Labor Party to snap out of the torpor that they'd been in. And the Turnbull government, with Labor's support, imposed foreign interference law to ban foreign interference and created a register where foreign agents have to put their names on a register, and a new law against espionage to toughen up against covert Chinese Communist Party activity, including United Front activity in Australia. And we've jailed the first convicted agent in Australia now under those laws. Huang Zhimou, the billionaire, was named persona non grata because he was undermining the rule of law. So that was a wake-up moment. But governments since have gone a bit soft, and the current government I would include in that. They don't want to confront our Chinese friends. They're happy to have the trade sanctions, the $20 billion in trade sanctions, removed. The trade sanctions, by the way, are part of a hybrid war. And I quoted Mick Ryan, the retired Australian general, who's a prominent strategic commentator around the world these days, saying that the Australian government loves to talk about stabilising the relationship. The Chinese government loves that just as much because it means that the Australian government is content and not prepared to do anything more. And one of the military elements that our Chinese friends have deployed as part of this hybrid war was famously the flotilla, the task group of 3 Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy vessels that circumnavigated the country in a demonstration of ability, reach, and an attempt to intimidate
The drama involving Chinese warships in the Tasman Sea has escalated with a second live firing drill this afternoon. It comes just a day after a similar incident in which passenger jets were forced to change course with little warning.
And Mick Ryan's very critical that the Australian government first didn't even announce that. It was leaked to the media. That's how from the US, actually. That's how it became public. And second, that the Australian response was to make excuses for it, to say, oh, it's innocent passage, it's okay. We don't need to do anything. And he thinks that Australia is giving a mush response to those provocations.
So what do you think China's actually seeking when it comes to Australia? We're not actually talking about the W word here, are we?
Well, we're talking about the hybrid W word, hybrid war. That's what they've been practicing. And I would say two things. Their big ambition is not something they've made a secret of. Xi Jinping, the president of China, from the moment they made him General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party at the end of 2012, said, my aim, we will take the initiative and establish dominance. The word he used was dominance. And he didn't qualify that by saying dominance over the Pacific or dominance over the South China Sea. He said dominance, and he means it. And in other speeches, he's talked about being at the centre of global affairs. It's all about asserting global dominance in an intelligent, shrewd, and yet unrelenting way. When it comes to Australia, of course, he wants Australia to be a part of that dominance. He wants to dominate. There are two particular aspects that I'd mention. One is we have a list from our Chinese friends which actually spelled out what they want from Australia. It was called the 14 grievances, or the 14 complaints that the Chinese embassy in Canberra delivered to a Channel 9 reporter around the same time that China was imposing those 20 billion in trade bans on Australian goods. And those 14 demands or grievances started with that Australia had too many constraints on its foreign investment regime. In other words, the Chinese government was saying, let us invest in your country as we please. The second one, by the way, was don't ban Huawei from your communication system. We want Huawei to be fully embedded in your system. All the way through to members of parliament must stop criticising China, and the Australian media must stop criticising China. So that's the Chinese log of demands. Australia should change its laws to suit China's interests and censor ourselves. And Chris, the second particular of what China is trying to achieve when it comes to Australia is exhibited by what they're doing with the Pacific Island states, where they want to make those island states subservient to Beijing. And one of their aims is to establish a military presence in the Pacific. And the idea there is to sever the lines of communication, sea lines of communication between Australia and the US, so that the US can't use Australia as a base in a contingency.
Okay, so with all that in mind, what is it that Australia really needs to be doing if you're getting back to the mush response? How does Australia show steel?
Australia's prepared to show a bit more steel when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine than it is about Chinese activities in our region, because Russia and Ukraine is far away. Australia is beyond Russia's reach. So you'll notice the government talking very tough about Russia. And Russia is a much clumsier and more obvious warfare state than the Chinese. The Chinese have achieved everything that they've achieved without having to fire a shot. They use military assets sometimes. They use civilian assets sometimes. They're flying every week. They're flying sorties into Japanese airspace, and the Japanese are scrambling their air force every week. Sometimes they're using their Coast Guard, for example, to push Philippines vessels around and assert Chinese dominance over the Philippines coasts. So that's all going on, but they've never had to fire a shot, which is genius, absolute genius. Perhaps their greatest achievement to date is that because Putin has thrown Russia into this actual, shooting war against Ukraine, that has so weakened Russia that Russia now depends on China for its fiscal survival, for its political cover, and for a range of other things. So really, Russia is now a vassal state of China's. China is the big one here. It's the big beast in the room, much more so than Russia, which is dependent on China. China's economy is more than 10 times the size of Russia's, by the way. So what does Australia need to do? It's demonstrating steel by supplying Ukraine. It's going soft on China. Sure, we are waging, as the Foreign Minister Penny Wong has said, a permanent contest, is her phrase, a permanent contest against China to keep influence in the Pacific Islands, in northern approaches to our country. So that's going on. They're active, they're reasonably outspoken, yet the flow of Chinese money into Australia, China's such a good export market, once again, the government is reluctant to do much more than that. Mick Ryan, for example, wants the government simply to talk openly about warfare, to say that we have to prepare for war, that, you avoid war by preparing for it, by being a hard target, not a soft one. The government's not increased the defence budget sufficiently to accommodate both our mainstream traditional defence assets plus AUKUS. The traditional defence budget is being bled to pay for AUKUS. So we really have to confront some pretty difficult choices here. And the first one that Mick Ryan says is we have to say the W word openly to the Australian public to prepare our mindset.
Okay, so finally, let me ask you about that. We're talking a lot about prodding and poking and staying in just the right side of the line here, but what are the chances that Russia goes beyond Ukraine? What are the chances that China goes after Taiwan, takes those next steps?
Well, the expert in fighting Russia is Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, of course, and he said just in the last few days that he fully expects that Putin will attack another European country. He won't wait till he's finished invading Ukraine. Which one, he said, who knows, and Putin likes to keep it like that. So he thinks he is going to invade the rest of Europe. The trend and direction of everything Putin's doing would support that, and his own rhetoric, his own language supports the idea that he wants to restore all the states which were part of the Soviet Union, and that would mean taking a bunch of countries in Europe, and he will take what he can get. In terms of China, China hasn't built the world's biggest navy for nothing. China is not massively building up its stock of nuclear weapons for recreational purposes. It's built a first-class military in every aspect and continues expanding, by the way, at breakneck speed. While you've got the American president ranting to troops about the enemy within America and deploying them to US cities, Xi Jinping continues to expand and increase the capability of the Chinese military. Taiwan is one of their aims, and they've made that very clear that if it won't come peacefully, they'll take it forcibly. But as I say, he's talked about dominance generally, and they're programmed to use soft power, hard power, sharp power, every other kind of power to dominate wherever he can, from Africa to Antarctica and everything in between. Rolls on.
Well, Peter, thank you as always for your insight.
Always a pleasure.